1864. The Civil War enters its fourth year. Although Union armies have made significant inroads in Tennessee and the Mississippi Valley, battle lines remain relatively unchanged in Virginia. At last, Lincoln finds a general who will fight. Ulysses S. Grant is appointed commander of all Union armies. He determines upon a simple but novel strategy. Advance simultaneously with all his forces on key enemy centers. Grant makes his headquarters with his largest force, the Army of the Potomac, a well-fed, well-supplied, and well-rested army that was ready for the coming ordeal. Confederate General Robert E. Lee understood the realities. His army of Northern Virginia is outnumbered nearly 2-to-1. Supplies are scarce. Obliged to conserve resources, he must fight a defensive war. With luck, his undaunted army will hold back Yankee invaders until fall presidential elections can potentially change the political landscape. The Union Army breaks camp on the evening of May 3rd. The men on both sides have little concept of the horror that lies ahead. The fighting in the coming weeks will kill and wound more of them than at any other time in American history. Grant will operate against Lee's right flank, using coastal waterways to establish and supply his army as it moves. But to carry out this plan, Grant has to advance into the fabled wilderness, a 70-square-mile tract of dense woods and thickets, poorly mapped, with few roads. Its thickets will neutralize Union superiority in numbers and artillery. Grant hopes he can get through it before Lee reacts. Lee does not allow this to happen. He sees that Grant's right is vulnerable and moves with Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps on Orange Turnpike and A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps on the Plank Road. James Longstreet's corps, recently arrived from East Tennessee, has greater distance to cover. Morning, May 5th. Armies collide on both thoroughfares as the struggle develops into two distinct battles, separated by trackless wilderness. Governor Warren's 5th and John Sedgwick's 6th Corps go into position on the right, centered about a clearing called Saunders Field, while Hancock's 2nd Corps occupies the strategic Brock Road intersection. Bitter but inconclusive fighting rages until dark. Grant prepares to deliver a decisive blow come morning. Meanwhile, the Confederates, exhausted and disorganized, anxiously await Longstreet's arrival. The Union attack begins at 5 a.m. Warren and Sedgwick are quickly contained on the turnpike. Hancock crushes a ragged Confederate line on Plank Road, and the day appears lost for Lee. Longstreet's arrival turns the tide as his brigades press Hancock back, but Longstreet is badly wounded at a critical moment. His attack loses momentum. Lee pauses and strikes again on the Brock Road. The fighting rages, but determined Union counterattacks drive the rebels back. Later that afternoon, Georgian John B. Gordon launches a vigorous attack on Sedgwick's exposed right flank, capturing many prisoners. But darkness ends the affair before further damage can be done. The fighting causes the dry woods to catch fire. Many wounded men perish in the flames. Both sides fortify their positions. Earthworks and trenches scar the landscape for miles. stalemate ensues. Soldiers are exhausted. Nearly 30,000 have been killed, wounded, or captured. This 3-day fight in the wilderness is the fourth bloodiest battle of the war up to that time. Both commanders have learned something about each other. Grant discovers Lee's army is more formidable than any opponent he has faced. Open flanks led to embarrassing reversals. Grant will ensure that this does not happen again during this campaign. Lee realizes his opponent is a man of different character. Grant is not retreating as his predecessors had. Instead, Grant pushes southward toward the crucial crossroads at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Union morale skyrockets. Grant is continuing the advance on Richmond. Warren's 5th Corps is leading the advance, slowed by Confederate cavalry. Warren reaches a clearing near Spotsylvania called Laurel Hill, but Lee has won the race to the crossroads. The path ahead is blocked by Joseph B. Kershaw's veteran division. Confederate forces quickly dig in, creating a formidable defensive position. George Meade, Army of the Potomac commander, orders Sedgwick's 6th Corps to support Warren in the attack on the Confederate position at Laurel Hill. It does not go well. Delays and ultimately concentrated rebel fire halts the attack. As the balance of the armies come up, the battle lines extend for miles. Both sides dig in and prepare for the upcoming ordeal. Union Cavalry Commander Philip Sheridan cuts loose on a raid towards Richmond. Grant hopes this move will force Confederate cavalry hero Jeb Stuart into a showdown battle with Sheridan, the competent Yankee newcomer. 3 days later at Yellow Tavern, Sheridan found his path blocked by Stuart. A sharp skirmish ensues. Jeb Stuart is mortally wounded and dies the next day. Heavy skirmishing continues throughout May 9th as Union soldiers probe the surrounding wilderness, trying to determine the position of Lee's army. Union General Sedgwick, beloved commander of the 6th Corps, is killed, the victim of a sharpshooter's bullet. Grant has received reinforcements in the form of Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps. He orders Burnside to advance on Spotsylvania along the Fredericksburg Road. This forces Lee to bend back his right flank, creating a vulnerable bulge in his lines, dubbed the Mule Shoe. Meanwhile, Lee entrenches his line and continues to improve it. Confederate artillery is positioned to pour crossfire upon any attacking column. After Sedgwick's death, Horatio Wright assumes command over the 6th Corps. He spies a weak point in the Confederate line and orders Colonel Emory Upton to exploit it. With 12 hand-picked regiments, the carefully planned attack advances in lines 4 regiments deep. It's an innovative idea. Upton's men burst out of trees a mere 200 yards from the rebel works and pour through the lines of the shocked Confederates. In desperate fighting, nearly 1,000 rebels are captured, but the Yankees get no support. Confederate reinforcements force Upton's attackers to retreat, abandoning their dead and wounded. Although a failure, this sort of attack was revolutionary in concept and execution. It will be used again. Heavy skirmishing continues along the line on May 11th, as both Grant and Lee plan their next moves. As his target, Grant selects the Mule Shoe. The attack is scheduled for early the next morning, May 12th. Throughout the day and well into the evening, Union troops move into position. Meanwhile, Lee uncharacteristically misinterprets Grant's intentions. He thinks Grant is about to retreat and removes key artillery pieces from the Mule Shoe. Modeled upon Upton's charge, a massive Union attack, spearheaded by Winfield Scott Hancock's veteran Second Corps, roll over the Confederate line. 5,000 rebels are captured, including 2 generals and numerous cannons. In desperate straits, Lee coordinates a series of counterattacks that drive Union forces back. The entire line was recaptured, except at the angle of the Bulge, or Mule Shoe itself, ever after christened the Bloody Angle. Here, a bitter struggle ensues as Union forces desperately cling to their limited gains against repeated Confederate counterattacks. The soldiers fight at point-blank range, with only a few feet between them. The battle rages along a narrow front. After 18 hours of constant combat, the Confederates withdraw to a hastily constructed reserve line. The two armies are exhausted after 7 days of intense fighting. Stymied, Grant proposes to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Over the next week, the battle lines pivot southward, but Grant resolves to break off the action at this point. Spotsylvania would emerge as the third bloodiest battle of the Civil War. In a bold move, Grant quits the field, hoping to turn Lee's right flank again and make for Richmond. Lee, however, knows his intentions and races for the North Anna River, 20 miles to the south. Arriving on May 22nd, Lee establishes a strong blocking position on a series of commanding bluffs south of the river. Grant reaches the North Anna on May 23rd and begins crossing that very day, testing the rebel lines. Several days of indecisive fighting follow as Grant realizes the formidable nature of Lee's position. It's a trap designed to force Grant to split his army into pieces where it can be defeated in detail. Grant withdraws across the river and once again advances around the Confederate right flank in search of an opportunity to catch Lee's veterans in the open, away from field fortifications. On the North Anna line, Lee has missed his best opportunity of striking a decisive blow. Lee knows that he must stop Grant before he reaches the Richmond area. If not, Grant will besiege the Confederate capital, and the city's demise would be a mere question of time. Grant cuts loose from the line at North Anna and sweeps southeast, closer to Richmond. The armies are back on familiar turf, ground of McClellan's campaign 2 years previous. The opposing forces clash on a front that stretches several miles along Topohomy Creek. By the 1st of June, Grant has pivoted around Richmond, and his soldiers seize the strategic crossroads at Old Cold Harbor. Fighting erupts near sundown, but the results are inconclusive. Grant, sensing an opportunity to crush Lee, orders the attack renewed at dawn. He awaits the arrival of significant reinforcements, William F. Smith's 18th Corps from Butler's Army of the James, operating south of Richmond. But reinforcements require additional time. The attack is postponed 24 hours until June 3rd. It is a fatal delay. Confederates use the time to consolidate and fortify their positions. Now, masters of the art, Lee's veterans erect elaborate earthworks with well-sighted artillery positions, creating deadly crossfires. Dawn, June 3rd. The 2nd, 6th, and 18th Corps assault the Confederate lines on a broad front and are repulsed with staggering losses. Confederate General Evander Law said, "It wasn't war, it was murder." For Grant's part, he wrote, "I always regretted the second attack at Cold Harbor." Once more, the two armies are in stalemate. Grant is unwilling to admit defeat and plans future operations. Meanwhile, conditions on the field are unbearably inhumane. No truce is declared to bury dead or recover wounded lying between opposing forces. Cutting railroads would isolate Richmond from the Deep South. Grant decides to take the war across the James River and strike Richmond from the south via the railroad center at Petersburg. Fooled, Lee fails to see his enemy's intentions, and Grant withdraws from the Cold Harbor line unmolested by Confederates. Union forces are reinvigorated by the mere sight of the James River. The horrors of the wilderness lay far behind. Most cross the wide river on lengthy pontoon bridges, an engineering feat thought to be impossible by many. The Overland campaign is over. There had never been such a bloodletting upon this continent. From the Rapidan to the James River, the butcher's bill was more than 80,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. All in less than 6 weeks. Contrary to popular opinion, both commanding generals displayed both brilliance and poor judgment. Grant fights his way to the gates of Richmond. Lee becomes pinned in the Richmond and Petersburg defenses. The Army of Northern Virginia has been staggered, but not destroyed. Lee, however, is unable to replace those lost, and his army will not recover from the recent ordeals. But his soldiers, man for man, have proven more than a match for Grant. The war enters a new phase in the more open country south of the James River. The fortified lines and breastworks extend for miles around Richmond and Petersburg. Lee's prophecy comes true. Grant crosses the James, besieges Richmond, and 10 months later, forces the demise of the Confederate capital, the Army of Northern Virginia, and ultimately, the Confederacy itself.